welcome everybody. My name is Simon Godwin and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company. Hello and welcome to another Shakespeare Hour Live. Well, it's been a gorgeous day here in Washington. I've come back to the city and it's been great to be walking along the streets and feeling the spring-like energy, and that joy and warmth has made it even more appropriate that tonight we're talking about Shakespeare and the environment. But before I introduce my wonderful guest this evening, a few thank yous. Well, Shakespeare Hour Live is part of a wider initiative, Shakespeare Everywhere, which is supported by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Additional support is generously supplied by Nan Beckley, and tonight's episode is sponsored in honor of Don Fox's birthday. Happy birthday, Don. And thank you for helping make tonight possible. Well, we have a terrific panel of guests this evening, and I'd like to introduce them all to you. Let me begin, if I may, with returning guest, Sir Jonathan Bate, renowned author, Shakespearean scholar, and biographer. He is the Foundation Professor of Environmental Humanities at Arizona State University and Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford. Jonathan, hello, good evening, and welcome.
Hello there. It's great to be back with you, Simon.
Oh, thank you so much, Jonathan. Now, I think you were with us last June for an episode on Shakespeare's life. And goodness me, what a lot has happened since. How are you, Jonathan?
Well, I'm very well. I mean, in one way, a lot has happened since. In another way, nothing's happened since, in that we're all still pretty well under lockdown. I mean, I've had my 2 Pfizer jabs, so I'm raring to go. Jabs, interesting. We say jabs in England, they say shots out here. I mean, jabs are kind of boxing metaphor, shots, well, perhaps typically American, I don't know. But yeah, no, I've been plugging away. And in fact, I've been sort of so confined that I've done an enormous amount of writing. And I've written about 1.5 books since we last met. So I think I just want to get away from my study.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad it's been a prolific time. I won't ask what you've written, Jonathan, but perhaps I can ask you, is it Shakespeare related?
The one that's half done is I'm actually, I've got to the age where I'm actually writing a memoir. And it's a memoir about my life with Shakespeare, going back to my brilliant school teachers who got me passionate about Shakespeare, to seeing Royal Shakespeare Company productions in that vintage period of 1970s and 80s, and just looking at how Shakespeare has shaped my life. So that is bringing back a lot of great memories.
Oh, wonderful, Jonathan. Well, I hope we're able to welcome you back for a 3rd time to perhaps talk about your memoirs. That would be a real joy. Susan Hilferty, Tony and Obie award-winning scenic designer, is also joining us this evening, whose credits cover Broadway, international theatre, opera, film, and more. At STC, Susan has designed the ORESTEIA, SALOMÉ, and The Tempest, and she's also chair for the Department of Design for Stage and Film at New York University. Susan, hello, good evening, and welcome.
I'm so glad to be here with you all. We've also had a beautiful day here in New York City, where I'm talking to you from. The joy of the seasons, the longer days, there's hope in the air. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight with you all.
Oh, wonderful, Susan. And I hear that you've been doing a lot of teaching, and actually you've been doing something that many of us haven't been, which is, I understand you've been back in the spaces, actually with people live doing classes. And is that right?
That's absolutely true. So I'm the chair of the graduate design program at NYU, which is a small but powerful organization. And we made the commitment when we knew we were able to get back that we would teach as much as we could in person. So I've been teaching, my classes are 6 hours long, so I teach twice a week in person, but fully masked. Right. 6 foot distance. We wash our hands all the time. All the social restrictions. So it's an amazing new way of doing literally everything. Walking out the front door is a different experience than it was a year ago. This Friday is the 1-year anniversary of us stepping away. And remember when we thought it was only going to be for a couple of weeks until the weather got warmer? Not true. So we really jumped in, and knowing that performance, it's a theater program, performance is essential. So we've been doing performances. There is very few people in the audience. The audience is all masked, we're separated. The performers, if those of you who are actors or directors, the performers are also masked, and don't get closer than 6 feet. So there's a whole new way of even addressing it. But being in the room, being in the space with actors in front of you, I wept the first time that I went there. I just wept. It's astonishing, the sense memory of having actors speaking words, sharing in a space. So in many ways, it's been glorious.
That's amazing, Susan. Maybe one silver lining of this tragic period will be that we will somehow reappreciate the shared humanity of our time together on planet Earth, and even maybe that sense of appreciation will extend to the planet Earth, which is a question we'll be also talking of more this evening. Thank you, Susan. Davis McCallum, Artistic Director of the critically acclaimed Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, is also with us. The festival was recently called by the New York Times a bucolic staple of New York summer theatre. How about that, everybody? Hello, Davis.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Great to see you, Davis. And are you with us for the bucolic world of your performance space this evening? I mean, you're indoors, which of course is immediately different from the outdoors. But yes, are you nearby?
No, I'm in my home in Cold Spring, New York. It was about a year ago tomorrow, 365 days ago tomorrow, that my kids and I moved to our place here in Cold Spring from our apartment in Brooklyn. And so it's been an amazing, transition for my whole family to experience a full year in one place, which I don't think I've really ever done. I have a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. And so when their schools shut down in Brooklyn or threatened to shut down, we moved to our summer place up here, and we've been kind of holed up here. So I have a whole new appreciation for just the way the cycles of the season roll. Yeah. And maybe that's something that we could talk about in relation to Shakespeare as well. We're diligently working on getting back to in-person performances, as Susan was talking about. Our theater is a 530-seat open-air tent overlooking the Hudson River. So we kind of jokingly say it's one of the best ventilated theaters in America. So we're planning a season of 2 shows, a new play by James Imes called The Most Spectacular Lamentable Trial of Ms. Martha Washington, which actually had a run in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and a production of The Tempest. It'll be our last season in our home of 35 years before we move to a new campus in 2022. So amongst all these other things, we've been thinking about what it means to make a transition from being a seasonal festival to a year-round cultural anchor for the Hudson Valley.
Great. Well, Davis, that's you've been going through a lot, but I'm glad you've been in one place to think about it all.
Yes, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. And also with us tonight is Grace Ann Roberts, SEC line producer, who's going to be a brilliant conduit, as always, between our guests and our amazing audience. Grace Ann, hello, good evening. Are you with us?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Yeah, it was a gorgeous day here in DC. I'm still reeling from it. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's weather too. So.
Oh wow, terrific! And Grace Ann, any warm comments from our audience already that you wanted to share?
Well, there is a lot of birthday love for Mr. Don Fox in the comments this evening, so we are so thrilled that he is celebrating with us tonight.
Oh, terrific. A true Shakespearean Don. That's wonderful. Well, last but not least, let me introduce my colleague and co-host, Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg. Drew, over to you to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Simon. So yeah, when one starts to think about Shakespeare and the environment, which is our topic tonight, one is tempted to say that it ranges both wide and deep throughout the entire canon. Of course, there are the green worlds to which Shakespeare invariably turns in his comedies and his romances, and perhaps in other plays, the Forest of Arden, and As You Like It, the forest outside Athens in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the pastoral Bohemia of the 4th act of The Winter's Tale, and many, many more. There are the great tempests or sea storms that set plots in motion or resolve them. In the Comedy of Errors, Twelfth Night, Pericles, Othello, of course, in The Tempest, after which that play is titled. And there are the great perturbations in nature, the signs of disorder or inversion, or one might even say of climate change in the canon. I'm thinking here, of course, of the great storm in Lear, the sense that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, Titania's extraordinary speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream, with its explicit references to the climates changing and swapping their clothes. So it often seems, in other words, as if nature and the environment don't just animate Shakespeare's language, but they also run deeply throughout his dramaturgy, that they affect us in a visceral way as well as in a metaphorical way. One might even say an immersive or an environmental way. So in the interest of exploring this topic, we've convened this extraordinary panel from 3 different disciplines to shed some light on this aspect of his art. Now, Jonathan, I thought it would be great if we could start with you, because you've actually written a new book, well, maybe not your newest book, because you keep churning them out rapidly, called The Song of the Earth, and your new position at Arizona State University, which is explicitly devoted to environmental concerns, is it not? So how do these concerns impact your research and your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've made a great introduction already, Drew, to our theme. So I want to just sort of introduce these ideas with 2 kind of focal points. One is something Drew's touched on already, and indeed observant viewers will have noticed on the bookshelf behind him a book called Some Versions of Pastoral by the great 20th century literary critic William Empson. Pastoral is a very ancient literary form. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece and then ancient Rome. Pastoral is the form in which nature, the country, is used as a way of offering a critique of the corruption, the alienation of the city, the court, and the modern world. Pastoral, it goes back to those ideas in ancient Greece that once there was a golden world where nobody had to work and shepherds would just sit on molehills playing on their pan pipes, and the fruit would pick itself and everything was perfect. And then the world went into a decline. Along came first agriculture, and then industry, technology, and indeed empire. Ovid, one of Shakespeare's favorite poets, perhaps the favorite of all his poets, described these as the 4 ages of man: the Golden Age, Silver Age, Brazen Age, and Iron Age. Pastoral is an attempt to get back to the Golden Age. And as Drew has reminded us, again and again in Shakespeare's plays, there is this move out from the city or the court into a green world, a second world, a pastoral world. As You Like It is the one where it's most specific, but in a typically brilliant Shakespearean way, the world of the forest in As You Like It is actually 3 different pastoral worlds at once. The story that he was dramatizing was set in the Forest of Arden in France, and there's a lot of French detail in the play. Monsieur Jacques, for example. But Shakespeare himself was brought up in the Forest of Arden, in the heart of England, and indeed his mother was called Mary Arden. And then thirdly, there are many references in the play to that classical Golden Age. Corin is a shepherd, very much as in classical pastoral. And indeed there is talk not only of Robin Hood, Sherwood Forest, again, the idea of a pastoral world, which is a better place than the world of the court, the city, the aristocracy, the world of wealth and corruption. But there are also references to the golden world. Here, they say of the exiled duke, they fleet the time carelessly, as they did in the Golden Age. Right through Shakespeare's career, he makes this move. And you mentioned The Winter's Tale, with which that has that move between the court of Sicilia, where everything goes wrong, and the country in Bohemia, where there is a sense of restoration. I've always been intrigued by the fact that in many ways, this is also a pattern in Shakespeare's life, isn't it? Most of his actors bought, on the proceeds of the plays, bought big houses in London, in posh London suburbs. Shakespeare didn't. He always rented property in London and regularly went back to Stratford, where he kept his family. So Shakespeare's whole life was a journey between the city and the court on the one hand, the country, Stratford-upon-Avon on the other. And I think that is a key element of his imagination. We even see it in tragedy, don't we? If you think of King Lear going out from the court to a world of nature, although that heath is rather bleaker than the Forest of Arden. The Tempest, Shakespeare's final solo-authored play, seems to me the one that this theme really comes to a climax, because there, after the storm, remember the first scene is on the ship, but after that, every part of the play takes place in the enclosed space of the island. And what we see on the island is a process of Prospero, the figure who in many ways represents empire, exploration, modernity, technology. He uses magic to control the elements, to control nature. But he can only do it with two people assisting him. One is Caliban, who was on the island before him, and the other is Ariel, who it seems to me represents the spirit of the island itself, the spirit of nature. Now, my current work as a professor of environmental humanities involves me in doing what has become known as literary eco-criticism. Just as a feminist critic would explore Shakespeare in relation to questions of gender, sexual relations, the representation of women, and just as a post-colonial critic would, perhaps especially using a figure such as Caliban, explore Shakespeare in relation to questions of empire, slavery, the voyage to the New World, the exploitation of the New World. So an eco-critic approaches Shakespeare from the point of view of how we think about the plays in relationship to how humankind relates to, manipulates, and in many ways destroys the environment. And I think Ariel is the key figure for that in The Tempest. Many post-colonial critics have written very wonderfully about Caliban. And of course, Caribbean and Black writers have sort of rewritten The Tempest from the point of view of Caliban. I want to imagine a rewriting of The Tempest from the point of view of Ariel. What does the island look like once Prospero and the rest finally leave?
Thank you, Jonathan. That's such a brilliant question to hold. And I'm so struck by this new perspective and how there is this such profound relationship between the kind of critical community and, as it were, the practical community, and how and the community of an audience, how we all need these different perspectives to suddenly throw new light on the plays, both theoretically, but also really, really practically. And I think that's perhaps why a good link to Susan, if I may hand over, Susan, to you to talk a little bit about, yes, your experience creating environments for Shakespeare, and whether there's anything that Jonathan's spoken about that you feel inspired to somehow speak to or address. Susan.
It's such an interesting question to understand about what a designer does in relationship to text and even thoughts about the text. So we're responders. We respond to not only the text, respond to the actors, the director. We're responders in a way that are always looking for clues and what this world will be. As a designer, I've done in my life 3 King Lears, for example. So the 3 King Lears, which one might say, well, it's the same text. So there was so it was basically the same. And I can't even tell you how different they were. Incredibly different, exactly the same words, exactly the same place, meaning in a theater. But because the point of view was different from the way we began, it meant that the casting was different, the environment was different. It was literally as if they were, you might as well have said that they were different texts. So, and it might be a surprise to some people who aren't designers, how dependent we are on the text. So I'm constantly mining it for clues. And the clues are in the words, and the clues sometimes aren't even that the author, we won't really know what Shakespeare thought about them, but if we have a living author, sometimes don't even know that they're planting the clues. And I'm constantly going back to the essential, which is earth, air, fire, and water. And every play is either they're in balance or they're out of balance. And this balance or out of balance is what is I'm trying to reflect in the work that I'm doing. And so that you can see that what I'm going to say, that the audience may not see specifically my point of view, but they will feel it. They won't necessarily know what is driving any of the choices I make, but they will feel it in the sense of what's happening in the evening. And so out of balance is something, frankly, is at the heart of drama. The world, if you go back to any of the Greek plays, what you're constantly running into is a world that's out of balance, and that we need to consult oracles, or we need to consult those that understand nature, whatever nature really is. So that, and that sometimes these guides, whether or not they're Ariel or all of these guides might shift us back into some kind of balance. But honestly, that is the cycle, that we will go out of balance. We were talking when we arrived about the sense today here in New York and in Washington, D.C., that the weather has shifted, and it's brought with it a sense of hope. We're in spring and we're moving forward. And this is just the sense of, yes, we're moving forward to summer, and then we'll move into fall, the harvest. Even if you follow the harvest in Shakespeare's plays, you'll see how that drives the sense of the celebration and positivity, even though we know we're about to go into winter. And then winter comes, and then the dream is, yes, these seeds, something's going to come back, and then we'll come back again. I'm a bird watcher, and the reason I'm a bird watcher is that I actually understand where I am on the earth. And I do it, it's something you can do anywhere. You have your binoculars, you walk through Central Park, you can walk through Moscow, you can walk through any place in the world. And the birds, just as we hear in many of those that are connected to nature, the birds really can tell us, not only are we near the ocean, are we in a mountain, are we near rivers, but that we can locate ourselves. So what happens as a designer, so when I'm out watching birds, I'm actually understanding this particular piece of earth in where I'm standing. As a designer, I'm using these clues to create a whole new world, a whole new culture in which it can rain. You know, I can make it rain. I can make it snow. I can make it. I'm sorry about the siren. I'm in New York City. What can I say? But these are the elements are alive and can be brought in terms of their power to our. And I go. One of the reasons I bring up the birds is I'm very aware that the world is constantly under threat. There are some cultures that know how to live with nature, but there are many of them, and we represent the many of them that don't understand, and that we have worked our way across the globe, creating havoc wherever we go. I went to the Galapagos, where I thought this was going to be the mythical original place. And I went with a dream of saying, oh my God, this is the heart of it. What I learned when I was there, that the Galapagos was known when ships started traversing the ocean, that they would stop at the Galapagos and stock up on those incredible tortoises, and they'd take hundreds of them at a time and keep them alive and eat them. And that's how they went across the sailing across the globe. So we'll talk more about how I use those thoughts in coming to in a design process.
Wow, Susan, thank you. What a wonderful journey from Shakespeare to the Galapagos Islands and to eating tortoises. I would very much like to know more about that. And I certainly enjoy the image of the stage designer as a kind of Prospero, who is absolutely, as you say, creating a world. And I love your point about the apparatus that you use of fire, water, that there's something very elemental. These terms is guiding you how to build these worlds. And I think that's reminds me of what a kind of the best productions I think that we see in the theatre are ones that work on the senses as well as just on the mind. Let me now, if I may, bring in Davis. Hello. Davis, I wonder, listening to Jonathan and to Susan, what ideas have been sparked from your practice? You're in an unusual setting in that I think you do a performance in a large tent. I'm so sorry, Davis, in my short time in America, I haven't yet visited your particular performance space, but it's certainly one that's closer to nature than many others. Davis.
That's right. And you have to come and visit, Simon. I mean, Susan was talking about creating place, and the director's art is really about creating an event, which is somehow about the combination of place and time. And as I was alluding to before, just as little as Jonathan was saying, Shakespeare's life was back and forth between Warwickshire and London, and that was my life up until a year ago. A little bit in reverse, because my family was in the city and my theater was here in the Hudson Valley. So I would ride the Metro North back and forth. But, being here for a whole year has offered me a little bit of a different perspective on Shakespeare. I guess I would say that, I've always felt that Shakespeare was a very place-based writer. And, you feel that he's very interested in the way the environment works on the characters. And that's, I think, part of the reason why he migrates a company of characters from the city to the country in the Pastoral. I also think he's very interested in how time works on us. And I feel like the experience of being in nature, I'm sure, Susan, you'd say that in the experience of bird watching, you can kind of lose track of time. You have this kind of out-of-body experience, this transportive experience without going anywhere. And I feel like the experience of being in nature is about reconnecting to both place and time, which of course are the kind of raw ingredients of theater making. I've been thinking a lot about the Pastoral, in part because we have been a summer outdoor theater. And the first play that I decided to direct in my theater was The Winter's Tale, which was a little like John Conklin saying, "Why don't you do Midsummer Night's Dream, in the summer in the daylight? Do The Winter's Tale outside in the summer." But there's this element of the Pastoral that I think I've also been thinking about living here in the country for a full year, which is that it puts us in touch with time, which is the same thing as saying it puts us in touch with death. Even in Arcadia, there am I. There was a deer that got caught in a fence near our house, and we smelled it first. And we had to figure out what to do with the deer carcass. It reminds me of that really weird small scene in As You Like It. Which is he who killed the deer? I'm always fascinated by those little bits where you're like, should we just cut this? Or is this, if this has nothing to do with the plot, maybe this has everything to do with the play. And we ought to figure out why it's here. It also reminds me of that since we were talking about Ariel, that Full Fathom 5, which is some of my favorite. If I had to pick maybe 6 lines of Shakespeare, it might be that. Because
David, do you have that? Do you have the piece of text to share with us? The Full Fathom 5 would be. I'm sure we'd love to hear,
sure,
especially your favorite 6 lines in Shakespeare. There's definitely room for that.
Well, it's Ariel's song that is to Ferdinand and is a kind of revelation to Ferdinand that his father is dead, which is in fact not true. But the text of it is, full fathom 5, thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Hark, now I hear them ding dong bell. And, it's just, you could just turn it over and over like a stone in water in your mind and it keeps kind of resonating different meanings. But, I love the fact that his bones are coral. A friend of mine was reminding me earlier that the coral is alive and a pearl is alive in an oyster. And that death here is rendered as this transformation rather than this end.
I suppose very much in keeping with some of the themes of The Winter's Tale, and indeed, I mean, in terms of death, rebirth, the natural cycle.
Yes, and it's a piece of theater. In the end, it's not true. Alonso's alive, so it's a bit of a story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's quite right. Jonathan, let me bring you back, because we've talked a lot about a lot of material there about creation of worlds, about weather in Shakespeare, about birds in Shakespeare. I'm thinking of It is the Lark and Not the Nightingale. And Davis has spoken so beautifully about is death and time. What are your thoughts? Yes, how's that been sparking things for you, Jonathan?
No, I think you're absolutely onto something here. That the sense of when you are in nature, you have to be aware of death, of mortality. The thing about killing the deer, there is scholars sometimes speak of a distinction between soft pastoral and hard pastoral. Soft pastoral is everybody, all those shepherds sitting around in the sunshine, singing their love songs. It's the kind of thing Shakespeare parodies very beautifully in As You Like It with Silvius and Phoebe. But Shakespeare's pastoral is more of a hard pastoral, in that, as the Duke in As You Like It recognizes, it's cold in the country. The wind blows. Again, thinking of Twelfth Night and King Lear, the fool in both plays singing "The rain, it raineth every day." Being in the country, you're forced to be in touch with the elements, and you've got to eat, you've got to survive. I'm afraid you have to kill the deer if you're going to survive. But there's a sort of primal quality to that. There's no extravagance, there's no waste in the world of the forest and the shepherd's world in The Winter's Tale, which is I think a big contrast from the kind of opulence and waste of wealth and the city. The other play that I think is so interesting for this theme of ours, far lesser known play, one that not so many of the directors and designers among you will have done, and that's Timon of Athens. Timon of Athens is a play that begins with a very, very wealthy man. I mean, he's phenomenally rich. He's a Jeff Bezos figure. But then he loses all his money and all his friends desert him. And what does he do? He goes into the wood outside Athens, and he starts digging around for roots, and he finds gold, but throws the gold away, because gold is no use to you when you're in the presence of nature, as opposed to the presence of a culture that depends on money and on capital and so on. And I mean, I do think, in terms of thinking about how we might make some of Shakespeare's lesser known plays fresh and alive for our time of environmental crisis, Timon of Athens might well be one for you to put on your list of potential shows to stage.
Well, Jonathan, I'm pleased to report that Timon of Athens has been done at the Shakespeare Theatre Company. It was the play, in fact, that was running when we closed down.
Oh my goodness!
Great minds. And indeed, I thought a lot about that play, about isolation, about the environment, about political unrest. When we were rehearsing the play, we thought, my goodness me, how could ever unrest threaten the state? And then we think, oh my goodness, all that's happened since. So I think you're bang on, Jonathan. It's terribly prophetic and prescient. Drew, how are you getting on? Thoughts from your bookshelf?
Yeah, so sorry, I bombed out of the conversation for briefly, but I've been back and I've been listening avidly and fascinatedly. It seems to me that this question of tactile familiarity with nature runs through all of the plays. You know, I'm thinking of The Shepherd and As You Like It, not Corin, the kind of Italian soft pastoral one that you were referring to, Jonathan, but the older one, who I think has in his scene with Touchstone asks him what it's like to handle sheep, and he says, well, you know, they're greasy and they smell bad. And this sense that he was a country lad from Warwickshire, unlike most of the people in this London theater world who were urbanites, and he knew whereof he spoke. He knew about nature. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the flowers, he knows the difference between all these different types of rural flowers in the country. And he's very accurate in his description of these flowers. And I think that's one of the things that's very appealing about Shakespeare now in our kind of post-industrial, modern, alienated from nature lives. We need to be like Davis and have a quarantine year in the Hudson River Valley to see nature through Shakespeare's eyes, maybe as he saw it. And I know that that's something that we wanted to explore in the second half of the show, is how can Shakespeare be our guide in this changing era of climate change? Simon.
Well, before I'd like to pivot back to Susan actually in a second and just hear, Susan, about whether, in a way, your work as a stage designer is in a response to the need in us to return to the tactility that we would once had in nature, but now look for in art, as it were, a way of resensitizing ourselves to each other and to our world. And also a little bit, Susan, if I may just stack up the questions for you about what it's been like working outside, whether that's something you've ever done, or you've deliberately stayed away from in terms of the degree of control that as a designer you can have inside as opposed to outside. Before that, I'm just going to speak, if I may, briefly about next week, because it's going to be our last episode of the Shakespeare Live before we have a spring break. But we will be back in May with more episodes, and you can see those future episodes, I hope, on your screen now. We'll be discussing the sonnets, the romance plays, and much more. If you haven't signed up yet, please visit our website and register today. And actually, before I hand over to Susan, Grace Ann, are there any thoughts or questions or comments or birthday wishes that you'd like to share from our audience that then our panelists can also respond to? Grace Ann.
Yes, lots of thoughts. One thing that I want to offer from viewer Ann Clark, picking up on something, Jonathan, you introduced a moment ago, and that Susan, you may be about to address, no waste is a key idea. And so even, you know, as eco-consciousness really becomes more and more popular with each passing year, you know, something that even audiences are picking up on. What are your sustainability practices? How are you building your sets, et cetera, et cetera. So, and Susan, you may have thoughts on that, but also something, Davis, that if I may quote you from an article about Hudson Valley's upcoming move, you said something that struck me when I read this article about Hudson Valley was that the land is our set. And that's obviously true, and anyone who knows anything about Hudson Valley knows that intuitively, but to hear you say it so explicitly or read it was really striking to me in thinking about this conversation. So maybe after Susan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on sustainability in the theater as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Grace Ann. That's a wonderful comment from the audience, and thank you for expanding on it. Yes, let's go to Susan. Thoughts around those questions, Susan, for you?
Well, there were several questions stacked up, so I'm not sure if I'll even get back into which ones were which. But oh my God, I can't even which one I'm going to think about first. Yes, I've worked outside. The year I did King Lear, I did one in the park and one over at Theater for a New Audience. And of course, the experiences were completely different, literally being inside a theater. And the other one, in many ways, having to wrestle with nature so that it doesn't get dark at the moment you want it to get dark. And it rains when you don't want it to rain. There are so many things that are that you hand over to the moment and you hand over to nature as it is in the moment. And it's always so interesting when you've actually been trying to create your own nature, and then that gets swept away by something that happens in the moment. I will have to say it's always riveting, and I'm sure, Davis, that you found the same thing in your theater, is that instead of feeling interrupted, oh no, I'll never be able to, this scene, it's been interrupted and we can't go on. What happens is that, in a rain pause, for instance, that everybody is willing to pause and wait. The audience, as always, every time I've been there, through thunderstorms, sometimes it'll be an hour. And then, but somehow the connection to the stage, through the words, to the world that has been created, remains so intact that as soon as the storm that isn't part of the play, not the tempest, but its own tempest, you can immediately go back in. So for me, that's always a thrilling moment, because it takes you back to the experience of being in a room with actors and words, how it can actually take you over. Going back to sustainability, the question of sustainability, my husband works in the movies, and he's asked this question all the time, and he's like, oh no, this is not the right profession to even talk about it, because you make it and then you throw it away. I did the first show at Playwrights Horizons here in New York City. And as they were building the theater, we were building the set. And the same a different group of carpenters, but carpenters were building the theater, were using exactly the same skills for something that was going to last for hopefully 100 years, as we were building it for maybe 10 weeks. And so I think maybe Jonathan has a thought that connects down to that.
You're just very brilliant. I mean, it's just occurred to me as you said that for the first time. Shakespeare's acting company recycled their theatre, didn't they? They took the original theatre and literally dismantled it piece of timber by piece of timber, shipped it over the Thames and reconstructed it. Recycled theatre, thanks to Shakespeare, Burbage and Friends.
You're absolutely right. That's exactly what happened. And so we have to maybe go back to that model. But when you think about not only that, they recycled their clothes. I mean, there was a sense that this is what this character wears. There's not a sense of inventing a whole new world. There were many elements that would be reused.
And on that, mostly they were second-hand clothes that belonged to courtiers. So because of their connections with the court, when, her lady so-and-so or Monsieur so-and-so, the courtier, wanted a new ruff, a new doublet, a new dress, the actors got the second-hand clothes.
No, absolutely true. Simon, but I think one of the things that one of the ways for us to do more sustainable theater is to go back to the model of a company of actors. I would have to say, for me, the joy of working at the Guthrie, or when I did The Tempest with Garland down and at the Garland Wright, which was an incredible production. But one of the ways to be able to recycle is if you have a company of actors who keep shifting, and so they help guide the recycling.
Yes, and create an ethos. And actually, I'm inspired by that decision to hand over to Davis, because Davis, you're contemplating a new space. You're already committed to a relationship with nature. Your new space is coming. Susan and Jonathan are both referring to historical precedents and aspirations to create a different kind of theatre making, which is environmentally sensitive, has certain values, be it a repertory company, be it reusing things, making things. Davis, it's a lot to ask you, but are you going for this? Is this part of your future? Do you have tips for us all? Davis?
Well, I don't have any tips, but that's very much been a part of our vision for the new home for the theater company. And we produce plays in rotating rep with a company of actors doing 2 or 3 plays at once. And because we produce in rep and under a tent, it means we do very little in the way of scenery, because we don't have the crew to change it over before the next night's show. And because we feel like, fundamentally it's about human gathering. And in a certain way, as Susan was saying at Shakespeare in the Park, sweet are the uses of adversity. And the toad does have a jewel in his head. When something goes wrong, when a raccoon crawls across the stage at the Delacorte, it's heaven. It's theater heaven. And you can't kind of throw those things away. And then as a director, I have found it very liberating that I feel that the fundamental setting for all of Shakespeare's plays is not the Forest of Arden or ancient Britain or, Eastcheap, but is the stage. That's really where the thing is set. And it sounds kind of glib to say it, but I mean, that's the reason why she comes on and says, this is the Forest of Arden. The language does so much of the work for you. And I also feel like the transformation of the space is facilitated by, a director not insisting that it is one thing or only one thing or primarily one thing. Like take a highly ambivalent play like Measure for Measure, which I did a couple years ago. And Simon, I know you recently directed it too. You'd consider in a design meeting and go back and forth about what is Vienna, like how corrupt is it? How nasty is it? And you could make a decision, and then you could convey that decision in design to an audience. But the play really is on a fulcrum where one person comes on and says, Vienna is this, and you should believe me. And then the next person comes on and says, oh, no, don't listen to him. It's this. And at the Globe, that debate would have been very, kind of finely balanced. I'm so excited to talk about sustainability, but let's come back to that.
I just want to pick up on something here, because I wonder, Davis and Susan, whether you've helped me to see that maybe our problem has been that we've been in the kind of Blackfriars world. I mean, I'm just thinking that, Wes Jonathan, you could talk us through this transition of Shakespeare's environment from outside, very much in the way of emphasizing the language, emphasizing the real nature. He goes to the indoor theatre and spectacle takes over. And I wonder whether we've been, locked in that expectation, in that cycle, sort of ever since. Jonathan, anything on that?
That's a very interesting point, Simon, because there is a bit of a paradox here in that if we think of those late plays that he wrote once after 1608, the acting company get the small indoor theatre at the Blackfriars. These late plays, in many ways, are his most nature-soaked outdoor plays. Cymbeline, again, they leave the court and they go off to the Welsh mountains. Pericles, he goes on a journey around the Mediterranean, the magic island of the Tempest, the voyage to Bohemia. So, he's doing these outdoor plays in indoor spaces. And that, I think, must be bound up with the point you were moving towards, which is the sense that he's writing at this time of urbanization, of London, the first major period of urbanization in the West, London becoming the biggest city in the world. In London, in the urban space, and for the theatre-going crowd, you can't actually get out to nature. So you recreate it instead in art. And at a larger level, we can't get back to that golden age, that pastoral world. We can't in reality, but we can imagine it in art. And by imagining it in art, we can imagine a better world for everybody.
Wow, that's beautiful, Jonathan. And I think that really resonates with me. True.
Yeah, and this idea of not just recycling your theater and moving it to south of the Thames, but calling it the Globe, right? Calling it the world, and that this is a kind of vessel or a passageway through which we can reappreciate the world. And it seems to me, picking up on what you were saying, Jonathan, that Shakespeare's plays themselves become a kind of pastoral golden age that we try to hearken to. And yet at the same time, Shakespeare is telling us at the end of his career in The Tempest, go out into the world, break your staff, let every third thought be of your grave, be in balance with nature, be mindful of your mortality, even abjure your art. Get rid of the theater and go out and live your life. It's fascinating the way these two antinomies keep on being in conversation. Simon.
But I wonder whether, Susan, I had a reference to a piece of text that I'd love Susan to bring into, because I think the piece of text that you wanted us to think about, Susan, speaks to so many of Davis's point about time, mortality, Drew, your point about being in the world, or how to live in the world. Susan, can I?
Yes, I'd love to. I did a production of Hamlet directed by Yael Farber, who many of you might remember from doing SALOMÉ. And it was an incredible production. Ruth Negga, and I know Yael and Ruth Negga were guests on this, so how exciting to be able for me to reinforce what happened. But for us, there's a simple speech in Hamlet It was a production of Hamlet. Ruth played Hamlet. And I'm going to read it not anywhere near like, but it actually was a pivotal piece of text for us to understand how unmoored the world was at in our production of Hamlet. Not a whit, says Hamlet, we defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man of aught he leaves knows, what is to leave betimes. Let be.
Beautiful, Susan. And let me ask our panelists just how, Jonathan, what does that text do to you right now, hearing it in the context of our discussion this evening? And then Davis, I'd love to ask you the same thing, Jonathan.
I think that notion of let be is the key to it. What will be, and sort of going back to my initial thoughts about thinking about the island of the Tempest after the humans with their politics and their revenge plots and their conspiracies, after they've left. Ariel is freed, the island is let to be. It's like the Galapagos Islands returning to how it was before first the imperial voyagers and then the tourists have desecrated it. Let it be, let it return. And I think this is a very late Shakespearean theme. We sometimes forget that Shakespeare's last play is not actually The Tempest. The Tempest is his last solo authored play, but he then, as he was handing over the reins of the writing for the production company, handing it over to this younger dramatist, John Fletcher, they co-wrote 2 or 3 plays together. And as far as we know, the last words that Shakespeare wrote for the play, for the stage, were the words at the very end of his play, The Two Noble Kinsmen, which is actually another play that goes out into the country. But it ends with the character of Theseus, who of course we remember from Midsummer Night's Dream, it's telling the rest of the survivors at the end of the tragedy to let things be, not to ask questions. Understanding what the gods have in mind for us, that's above our question. Theseus says, let's go off and bear us like the time. That sense of acceptance. I think Shakespeare probably got that from reading the great French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who in turn was very influenced by the classical philosophy of the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who says, we have bodies, we are mortal, we have to accept mortality. It's what Drew was saying. And we just have to allow that process to go on. In the end, says Epicurus, we are just atoms, we are dust, we one day will be scattered back into the earth.
Wonderful, Jonathan, thank you. I want to pick up on something there, but before I do, Davis, those words that Susan shared, Jonathan's thoughts, where are you on this, David? What stirred for you, Davis? What stirred for you?
Well, I love that speech, and I'm grooving with what Sir Jonathan was just saying. You know, Corin has come up twice, and if you kind of close your eyes and think it's not the Prince of Denmark, you could imagine that speech coming out of Corin's mouth in a different way. You know what I mean? It's almost monosyllabic, and it has this kind of natural, you know, it is what it is type quality to it. There was this speech that I wanted to just read and kind of like hold in our mind in tension or in parallel with the one that Susan just read. See if I can get my eyes to focus. It's in this kind of duet with Touchstone about how like you, this shepherd's life, Master Touchstone, and Touchstone says it's this, and then it's that, and it's this, and it's that. And then he says, hast any philosophy in thee, shepherd, speaking of Epicurus. And Corin says, no more, but that I know the more one sickens, the worse at ease he is. And that he that wants money, means, and content is without 3 good friends. That the property of rain is to wet and fire to burn. That good pasture makes for fat sheep. And the great cause of the night is lack of the sun. And that he that hath learned no wit by nature nor art may complain of good breeding, or comes of a very dull kindred. And Touchstone's response is right to your point about about philosophy and nature, although there's a pun in it, such a one is a natural philosopher, you know. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful, wonderful. Oh, Drew has something to speak to some of that. Drew.
Well, I just think what I love, I think it's a brilliant linkage, Davis, that you make between Cora and Hamlet. I don't know if I've ever seen that before, but totally convinced and convincing. And what I have always loved about the Hamlet speech, coming from a theater practitioner mindset, when I was working on the play, I discovered that the belief is, and maybe Jonathan, you can correct me, but this is a late revision by Shakespeare to the text. I believe it's in the folio and none of the earlier quartos, and which also contains allusions to the children's company. So it seems to have been written later, and it's in prose. It's not in verse. This famous speech of Hamlet's. It is plain spoken Warwickshire wisdom, bird watching, the evanescence of life, and yet it is beautiful poetry, profound philosophy. Some of the greatest writing in the entire canon. Simon.
Well, Drew, before Jonathan responds to a little bit of textual debate there, let's just, Grace and I want to just give our audience a chance to share any thoughts or questions that they might have been writing in. Anything, Grace Ann, to share with us? Because in a moment, I'm going to hand over to our panelists to kind of sum up. We've got a few minutes left. So, Jonathan, hold Drew's question and we'll be returning to answer that. And there'll be some possibly additions as well. Grace Ann.
Yes, I will leave you with this one question from viewer Patrick that you may want to address in your final thoughts. You may not, but I think it's a good broad question. Patrick asks, is nature more often an antagonist or a protagonist in the plays? And so maybe not in the plays, maybe in the world, maybe in this conversation. If any of you have any thoughts on that, I would love to hear.
It's a big one to share.
I know it's a hardball. So
thank you. This is why we're here. So I think we've got about 2 minutes each. Davis, would you like to speak to that? Jonathan, still keeping the textual question in mind.
I know that's a really hard question to throw to me first, but I'm going to go for it. And
right.
that way, we can end on a high note. I feel like Susan mentioned Lear. There's a way in which it kind of operates as a pastoral in reverse, or some kind of photo negative of the pastoral. And nature is this kind of catalyst for elusive self-knowledge, and that ultimately it brings us into touch with the fundamental state of being alive and being human. So I don't know whether that's an antagonist or a protagonist, but more like a kind of crucible that is the drama itself or contains it. I would just like to say, all of us who care about the theater, have a real challenge ahead. We're the kind of people who worry about, where to recycle our yogurt container on a 10-minute break, and then build a huge rotating set and throw it out the back of the theater the day after the show closes. And there's a real wake-up call coming for the whole American theater about our sustainability practices. And and that has a human component too. I think we're also in the middle of reevaluating how we make work and how we value, human endeavor and people's time. And I think that those two things will go hand in hand towards a more sustainable and equitable theater. And I think you're right that there's some things we could learn from models that have gone before, repertory actors.
Yeah, I mean, I think the global humbling, as Zadie Smith put it, which I think you're alluding to, of the last 12 months. Susan, you wanted to come in, and let me hand over to you for your closing remarks, and then we'll go to Jonathan. Susan.
Perfect. So, well, I wanted to connect to that because I'm connecting back to what Jonathan said before, which is talking about spectacle at the end of the Shakespeare's career. And what I do know is that you cannot recreate nature. And the idea of spectacle, when it takes over, is always going to defeat us. And I think you're right now, Davis, that the challenge is how can we sustain, or how can we sustain theater? Sustainability is my big word in terms of our culture, in terms of theater. And so what I say is text is all, that you don't need spectacle. That's not why we have theater. We can do it in so many other venues. But if you text, actors, and in an environment that allows the words to be heard. So design doesn't have to be spectacle. It's about making the truth of the word. So I celebrate and say, yes, we can do it. And we can just follow that as our mantra.
Wow, Susan, thank you. That is just so inspiring hearing Davis, and then you speak about the text to speak at the center of everything. I think that's a beautiful way of, a liberating way of seeing the future. Jonathan.
I'm not going to get into the textual minutiae if I only have 2 minutes, but I just want to say something else in relation to that speech of Hamlet's, because it is the great example of Hamlet coming to acceptance of death. And what I want to link that back to is the brilliant point Susan made early on, talking about the importance of the 4 elements in Shakespeare: earth, air, fire, and water, in the language, and then in the way they can be used in stage design. Because, of course, the Elizabethans believed that just as the world, the planet, was made of 4 elements, the human psyche, the human self, was made of the so-called 4 humours: the choleric, the sanguine, the phlegmatic, and the melancholy. And being ill, mentally ill, psychologically unwell, was having your humours out of balance. Hamlet is the prime example, along with Jake's in As You Like It, of the melancholy man, the person who has an excess of one of these 4 humours. But at the end of the play, Hamlet seems to come back into a balance. And I think that in a way is the message that our theme gives us, that for human life, both at the individual and the societal level, to be sustainable, we need a balance. And at the same time, we need a balance in planetary sustainability. I think the kind of coincidence of the 4 elements and the 4 psychological humours suggests that for Shakespeare, human health and planetary health must go hand in glove.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. And just one final association that's come to me listening to our panelists tonight has been, based as I am now in Virginia, the efforts in rewilding the landscape as such a remarkable demonstration of letting be in practical action. And so I just share that marriage of a Shakespearean aspirational piece of advice and some physical realities. Drew.
Yeah, we are testing people's patience, but the question about antagonist or protagonist brought to mind, and we haven't discussed it tonight, but the Scottish play Macbeth, which of course begins with an invocation of fair is foul and foul is fair. This idea that nature is both the antagonist and the protagonist. It giveth and it taketh away. It is the great equivocator with human destiny. And as you were saying, Jonathan, so brilliantly, if those things can come into balance, personally as well as globally, it seems to be that that's what Shakespeare is working towards. So thinking of it as this malevolent and also benign force at the same time is such a fundamental aspect of Shakespeare's writing.
But time is, of course, the greatest equivocator. So it is indeed time for us to finish. Thank you so much. Next week, just briefly, somewhat surprisingly, we're going to end with a non-Shakespeare play, very controversial for the Shakespeare Hour Live. It is The Crucible, by the quintessential American playwright Arthur Miller, a play we hope to be producing in our reopening season. And we were wondering whether one could argue that Miller continues in a Shakespearean tradition. Joining us to debate this question will be Premier Miller Scholar Professor Sue Abbotson, actor Jason Butler-Hana, and last but not least, STC Associate Director Whitney White. We hope to see you all next Wednesday, and my huge thanks to Susan, Jonathan, Davis, Drew, Grace Ann, and all of you for watching. See you all next week. God bless and goodbye.